All right. We'd like to welcome everybody who is coming to this webinar on Land Use and Development Forum. We're going to wait just a minute or two until we are able to give most everybody that wants to be part of this as part of the beginning. So give us one more minute and then we'll get started. It looks like the participants have kind of leveled off, so maybe we should get started. Welcome everyone to the Land Use and Development Forum discussion tonight. My name is Jim Pashik with Pashik MTR. We're a community planning firm that have the privilege of both working on the Implementable Comprehensive Plan for Marshall Township and the privilege to present to you tonight. I think will be a very interesting discussion about land use on the western portions of Marshall Township. Go ahead and hit the slide. As part of this discussion, we look forward for you to ask the panelists some questions, and we've done that so that if you could go to the bar, it's either at the top or the bottom of your monitor in this meeting, and go to the Q&A, you'll be able to submit questions, and we have some people lined up to take a look at those questions and then see how we can fit them into the discussions that we have. We have a series of questions already, but we would welcome and encourage other people to do so as you listen to the panelists and anything that any kind of follow-up questions or things that you think need clarified. I would encourage you to type in your question in the Q&A button. So one might reasonably question, why in the world do we have a panel discussion on land use on the western side of the township tonight? And it's really as a result of a couple different things that were happening concurrently. The township has retained us to begin updating the comprehensive plan and to develop an implementable comprehensive plan. And part of that is starting to identify what are the key issues the community cares about in the community, and how could we start to make things even better. Marshall Township is a great community, and what we want to do is make it even better. And this comprehensive plan will be a policy document that guides the community into the future as to how that might be. So concurrently with that, we started asking people, what are the key issues in the community? What should this plan focus on? Because part of being an implementable plan is that it doesn't look at hundreds of things, but it really focuses on a few key issues in the community and ways to make them better. And we kept hearing from lots of different sources that one of the key issues is this issue of how do we deal with the future development of the western portion of the township? How do we guide elected officials in making decisions in the future? How do we express the community's desire, whatever that is, for that kind of development? So you were telling us from a variety of different ways that how we proceed with developing the western side of the township is really a key issue and that we ought to be thinking about it. And the third thing is that we sent out a questionnaire to the community. Hopefully most of you have responded to that questionnaire. We had about 900 responses, which is terrific. We were really pleased with those. And a lot of the people, when we gave you a chance to kind of say, and what else would you like to know about this community, what would you like to tell us about the community, you talked about your concerns about the development on the western side. So it was kind of a convergence of all three of these kinds of inputs that started to think that maybe what we ought to do is have a conversation about what other communities have been doing as it relates to developing land that is not currently developed. What are the best practices that we should be thinking about as we move forward in developing policy guidelines as part of this new comprehensive plan? So we are very fortunate to have some amazing people on this panel, and I'd like to just share briefly their bios for those of you that might not know these people. Roy Kraynyk is a native of Pittsburgh with a degree in landscape architecture from Penn State University. Roy's career has focused on land conservation, planning, and protection. Over his career, he has protected more than 5,000 acres of green space and farmland with a value exceeding $17 million. He believes that strategic land conservation can be applied to address regional threats of flooding, landslides, and poor air and water quality. As Vice President of Land Protection for Allegheny Land Trust, his career includes authoring or managing several land conservation-centric reports, including Allegheny County Greenways, a physical and ecological investigation of Pittsburgh's hillsides, Sewickley Heights Vision Plan, and most recently, the 2020 Big Sewickley Creek Rivers Conservation and Stewardship Plan, published by the Allegheny Land Trust. Roy currently serves as the Bell Acres Planning Commission and also on the Little Sewickley Creek Watershed Association Board of Directors. Roy, thanks so much for being here tonight.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me.
The next one I'd like to mention is Ann Hutchinson. She's a certified planner and is Senior Director of Community Planning for the Natural Lands, and works with municipal officials and planners in developing ordinances and subdivision plans that enable communities to conserve their open space and natural resources as part of their development process. So this is right up Ann's alley, this discussion that we're having tonight. Before working for Natural Lands, Ann was the Planning Community Development Director in Lower Marion Township, a lively first-string suburb of Philadelphia. Ann earned her BA in English Literature from Northwestern University and a Master's in Landscape Architecture from the State University of New York, Syracuse. She is a member of the American Institute of Certified Planners and a longtime friend. Ann, I really appreciate that you've joined us tonight.
Thank you.
Susan Smith is founder and owner of the Law Office of Susan Smith, who practices in the area of land use, municipal, environmental, and public utility law before municipalities, Commonwealth agencies, and the Pennsylvania and federal courts, and in behalf of private, corporate, and municipal clients. She serves as solicitor and special land use counsel to municipalities throughout the Commonwealth. She served as legal counsel for the recent updates to the Department of Community and Economic Development's Planning Series publications. Ms. Smith regularly lectures on legal and non-legal professions and officials in land use law. She taught land use law at Ambler College, in Temple University, and she's a course planner for the Pennsylvania Bar Institute's Biennial Land Use Institute. Prior to practicing law, Ms. Smith was a professional and municipal land use planner. She served as the zoning administrator of the city of Charleston, South Carolina.
Cool.
Susan, we're really appreciative of the knowledge you bring to this panel tonight.
Thank you. I hope I can be useful.
Absolutely. So we have a series of slides. Just most of you that are from Marshall Township are very familiar and drive these roads all the time, but we wanted to show a couple of the slides to remind us what it is, the incredible unique resource that we're talking about tonight. This aerial photo shows the western part. You can see Big Sewickley Creek Road in the bottom left of the picture. And you have Warrendale Bain Road that runs along the Big Sewickley Creek along the left side and eventually wraps up around to the north and crosses at I-79 there. So it's a huge undeveloped area of land in the township that we're talking about in terms of the future for this area. Go ahead.
Good evening, everybody. I'm Jenny Easton, a colleague of Jim's at Pashik MTR. The Township zoning ordinance is its most powerful tool for shaping land development. So without getting too far into the weeds here, it's important to start tonight's conversation with an understanding of the type of regulations that are now in place. So this is the Township's full zoning map showing the various districts by color. You can see suburban residential in yellow over on the eastern side, as well as the districts where you would find commercial, industrial, and mixed uses. Each district has its own set of permitted land uses and rules governing the placement and intensity of development. The light brown kind of khaki color you see covering an especially large extent is the conservation residential district. The township adopted this zoning in 2008, following adoption of the last comprehensive plan in 2006. Both the plan and the ordinance took into account the sanitary authority's approval of the Big Sewickley Creek sewer extension, the purpose of which was to address the environmental hazard of several failing septic systems in that area. The line runs down Warrendale Bain Road to Big Sewickley Creek Road, and it comes with development pressure. Recognizing that in the 2006 comprehensive plan, the township identified numerous environmental resources that warrant protection on the western side and said, I quote, "The challenge to be faced in writing the new zoning ordinance will be to ensure that landowners have the ability to develop their property if desired, while preserving as much of the natural environment as possible." And so their conservation residential district was born. The text on this slide is from the current zoning ordinance explaining the intent of the regulations that apply on the township's western side. In light of the sewer extension, these regulations accommodate housing development primarily in the form of conservation subdivisions designed to preserve sensitive environmental areas. The primary difference between a conservation residential subdivision and the regular type is the location of the homes, in that they're clustered so that a large share of the potentially buildable area on the site is devoted to undivided, permanently protected open space. By contrast, conventional subdivisions, as you see here on the right, devote most or all of the buildable area to individual lots. Conservation subdivisions are density neutral in most cases, meaning that the same number of lots and homes exist on the site as would be permitted under a traditional conventional subdivision. They're just clustered as opposed to being spread evenly over the entire site without consideration for the environmental features. So the classic approach to conservation subdivision, and the one the township's ordinance uses, involves a four-step process to determine the optimal configuration of homes and infrastructure to protect sensitive natural resources. It goes like this. Step one, you carve out primary and secondary conservation areas. Some features like floodplains, wetlands, and steep slopes are likely already protected by existing development regulations, other ordinances, and those are usually the highest priorities for conservation. Other secondary conservation features are the best of the rest. So those might include things like mature woodlands, historic sites or structures, wildlife habitat, prime farmland, groundwater recharge areas, scenic view sheds, you name it. Whatever a community decides is important. Once that's carved out, step two would consist of locating house sites in relation to that protected open space to add livability, marketability, and value to the homes. Step three is then to connect the dots with streets and trails. And step four consists simply of drawing in the lot lines. So in the end, the idea would be that you have a significant percentage of buildable land permanently protected in such a manner as to create interconnecting greenways. The advantage is more habitat for wildlife, more filtering and retention of stormwater runoff, less new infrastructure being built, and the potential, at least, to preserve a natural sense of place. So here's an example of how this plays out locally. This is the same zoning map we saw a few slides back, zoomed down to show the Mallard Pond plan off of Spang Road. You see it there in the snazzy pink crosshatch. The next slides will show how that four-step process for the site carved out more than half of it as permanently protected greenway. So step one, again, the highest priority conservation areas are carved out. Here it would be stream channel, wetlands, and steep slopes in particular, which left these areas shown in green as potential development areas where homes can be placed. Homes are then arranged within that area, and the dots are connected with infrastructure, and the lot lines are drawn in. So my understanding is that in the context of updating the comprehensive plan, the township is thinking about this district and the way it's working at this point, and would consider recalibration or adjustment to make sure it's achieving its desired aim, as well as considering other tools or approaches. That is the reason we've invited this exceptionally qualified panel to let us know what's out there and what works.
So I just wanted to remind you again, this is a repeat of the slide, but remember that if, as we go along and you hear something from a panelist and you would like a follow-up question, please put it in the Q&A button, and someone in our system will figure that out. It won't be me, but somebody will, who's much more technologically savvy than me. We have prepared a series of questions for the panelists, and we hope to have time to add your questions, and I'm sure we will before we're done by 8:30. So if you could go to the next slide. Oops, we needed one more.
Oh,
slide.
sorry. One more. Okay, here we go. Get back there.
So many residents have expressed a preference to limit the development of land on the western side of the township. So the question for each of the panelists, and I'm going to start with Roy, is what could the township do to preserve more green space on its western side? Roy?
Thanks, Jim. Let me start by just saying, I think there's two matters or two questions on the table. One is how to preserve the green space and what the development footprint looks like in the western sector. We talked a little bit about the cluster development and conservation subdivision, but also that's just the way that the footprint of development would look like, whether it's concentrated or whether it's more sprawling with large lots. The other question at hand, though, here I think is, what is the capacity of the township to accommodate more people? So you've got this issue of what the development footprint is going to look like, but you also have the question of how much population will that development footprint accommodate? I understand there might be potentially room, or based on zoning, about 3,000 to 5,000 more people that could be living in the western sector. Based on the average household of 2.8 people in Marshall Township, that's between 1,000 to 1,700 households. So, what does that look like? I mean, if you talk about extremes, you could put that many people in a number of high rises that might occupy 100 acres, or you could spread those people over 3,000 acres. So that's part of the question is how much population do you want in the community, and what does that footprint look like? So then you get into the question of what impact does that population have on the community? So if we would take the say 1,000 households in the next whatever 5 or 10 years, what kind of impact does it have on the infrastructure? Based on traffic engineering trip manuals, 1,000 households would generate about 10,000 vehicles per day. So what kind of impact does that have on the community? What kind of impact does that have on the budget? Will roads have to be widened and improved? Will traffic signals need to be installed? So, and how does that get paid for? Because that could create more demand on public safety and public works. So these are just some of the consequences of those decisions about not only what does the footprint look like, but how many people do you want to accommodate? Then obviously the school district is a factor as well. Does a school district have the capacity to accommodate that many more people in the next several years or decade or whatever it might be? So it's not just a question of how you protect the green space, but it's also a question of what kind of development pattern you want to have and what kind of population you want to accommodate. I can get into a lot of detail on how to protect green space. Obviously, zoning is the first line of defense, but you also have to enforce that zoning. And your zoning hearing board, has to be, strong about that and not be granting waivers and variances at random. So I can get into more detail concerning the hows and, you know, the funding options, but perhaps, you know, maybe Ann or someone would like to chime in as well in response to this question.
Go ahead, Ann.
Yeah, well, I'd say that townships I've worked with across Pennsylvania, I've worked with a little more than 140 of them. The most successful communities at preserving green space, you know, have more than one arrow in their quiver. They use more than one technique. And as Roy said, you know, zoning is a first line of defense. Land in this country is zoned for development. Even if you don't have zoning in Pennsylvania, development then reverts to 1 home per acre. So zoning is one tool, and the zoning that preserves open space has conservation standards. And I think that your specific standard that open space is interconnected. It's not just the land you can't build on anyway, but it's a high percentage of good land, is a really important tool. The communities that I see that are most successful, though, also look at preserving some land in its entirety. You have a big heart of state game lands where you won't see houses built. Perhaps there are landowners in your community who might consider donating the land, or maybe the township doesn't want to own more land, but they'd like to see it preserved with a conservation easement. And that's where organizations like Roy's, the Allegheny Land Trust, your local land trust, can be very helpful. And some townships that want to preserve land go to an open space referendum. They ask their voters if they'd like to see government tax them a little bit or take out a bond. And the communities that do that can leverage their money with state money from DCNR, the Department of Conservation and Natural Resources. So when you combine land conservation, voluntary and government-led, with good zoning, you have a pretty good chance of seeing some of the most important features, however those are defined in your comp plan and open space plan, preserved.
Susan.
I'm gonna echo what's already been said in terms of your options, and particularly, you know, encourage, you know, folks to consider that zoning isn't the only game in town. It's only one tool. And it's a tool to implement the policies, the land use policies of the municipality. So I often start with, if you really want to talk about this issue from soup to nuts, you need to begin with a clear indication or definition or description of what the land use policy is of your governing body, your board of supervisors, your borough council, if you're a borough listening in. And then once you have that policy established, then you look to the tools that might implement it. And as have been described, zoning is one tool. I'm going to caution you about that in just a minute in terms of its use. Certainly, conservation easements are another tool. Whether the voluntary agreements, you sometimes get property owners who are not willing to go into some organized conservation program, but are still willing to conserve their lands. They have voluntarily chosen to do that, and they put deed restrictions on their properties, for example, in order to accomplish that. And then you have the municipalities who have the political will, the wherewithal, and the community support to consider the idea of a referendum for the application of public monies to acquire property for a particular purpose. And again, at the end of the day, there is also nothing that stops a municipality from choosing to take its revenues and say, we simply are going to buy a piece of property just like any other property owner. And it's not through a referendum. It's simply saying as a choice that particular governing board thinks there's a value to acquire a piece of property. So this is not open space, but I know of a small borough, very small budget, who made a very, very serious decision to take what revenues it had to purchase a piece of property that had some historical value. And then to invest in the renovation of that property and the use of the property. But I can tell you that they watched that property value for many, many years before they bought it, so that they had a fair understanding of what the value was. They weren't overpaying for it. And so purchases of property are important as well. And again, in that case, the municipality is a property owner. It's not operating in its governmental capacity. I said I was going to caution you about zoning. So the caution about zoning, and you'll hear this from me probably throughout this program, is that zoning is, in the eyes of the law and as articulated by the courts, anathema to private property rights. So we always are balancing, as a legal issue, how far can you take or regulate someone's property versus allowing that property owner to do what they wish with their property. And there's lots of different tentacles to the principles that are in play there. But I want to make sure you understand that tension is always in place as to when does a municipality go too far in using its zoning powers to regulate land use, okay, including to protect open space. And my last comment is we need to really fill out or flesh out what you're talking about when you're talking about open space. Are you talking about protecting environmentally sensitive lands for various of the purposes that you've articulated that have public value? Or do you have some idea that open space is something more? It isn't necessarily just environmentally sensitive lands, but it's other lands that have some value. And when you get to that definition or that description of open space is when you might get into some legal issues about how far can you go, because then you're talking about limiting somebody's private property rights in a manner that you've got to have your reasons for doing so pretty clearly set out.
Thanks, Susan. I wanted to, Susan, if I could just follow up on something Roy said. So Roy was starting to frame the question in terms of capacity of the community. And it struck me as kind of interesting, this idea, is the municipality required to provide for growth? I mean, rapidly growing suburban community, there's demand for housing in this area. What is the role of the municipality for meeting that demand for growth?
We could spend a whole program on that issue, but the general concepts are, I'll lay out the general principles. A municipality must provide for all lawful uses. So, first and foremost, you got to think that while you might not have a particular use in your township today, you might have it tomorrow. You can't close the door to a lawful use. In terms of capacity, the question is, when can a municipality close its doors? Technically, it should never articulate that it is closing its doors to development or from outsiders, because that is the line that the courts have clearly drawn to say you cannot close your doors to growth when growth is coming toward you. However, you can look to your facts and figures about your municipality. How large is it? How much land use is there? How many people are there? What's your growth rate? What's your anticipated growth rate? What are your growth generators, whether they be internal? The existence of infrastructure, road, sewer, water infrastructure is important there, or it's a growth pressure from outside, a neighboring municipality that's growing very quickly, or you're right on the edges of a city. You can look to all of that data to determine what is, and there are some guidances out there, standards out there, determine how much growth is enough to support your particular community and its anticipated growth over a period of time. So you don't have to say, if you're a municipality that's growing, very, very slowly, has no growth pressures, you certainly don't have to provide in your zoning ordinance for high density in every, throughout your municipality, because that's just not relevant to your municipality. But you do have to have those facts and figures before you set out your regulatory program. When you try to justify a standard that you pick, particularly a numeric standard, after the fact is often when the courts will say on challenge, you're just making it up now to support what you did. You really need to do that homework in advance before you set out your regulatory program in terms of standards.
Great, thanks, Susan. And I just was curious, you started to talk a little bit about conservation subdivision design, and obviously the township has embraced that concept by incorporating it in their conservation residential zoning district. Can you describe some more about environmentally sensitive areas that have been preserved or envisioned, and what are some of the challenges of implementing conservation subdivision design? What are some of the struggles that people go through when they try to use and apply these ordinances?
Well, I think initially the first ordinance of this type was adopted in Pennsylvania in 1990, although there had been older sort of cluster codes before that. But this technique specifically said that you go through a process where you identify the open space first. Traditionally, a developer would sort of scale back the roads a certain distance from the stream and put in the roads and houses first. So change is always challenging. So I think one of the most important things that was done in Pennsylvania when DCNR and the governor's policy office endorsed this zoning approach is they had an attorney look at it and they said, you know, if the underlying zoning is appropriate, and that's always a big F, that this technique is defensible. And I think it's defensible because the applicant is getting the same number of homes, just rearranged a little differently. Now, the benefit to the community is that you have not only that land that can't be built on anyway, like wetlands and something that's too steep to get the bulldozer up, but you also have some good land to buffer it. But in return, probably the most expensive cost in land development is the big pan grader that clears the site. And if the developer only has to take that pan grader over 40 or 50% of the site rather than 100%, there's some savings there. The other thing that's important, and your ordinances, in my view, meet this criteria, is that the resulting lot is reasonably sized so that the developer's building really the same product. Years ago, I had a forum with developers when this technique was very new. And finally, one of them said, you know, I can build the same house on a 30,000 square foot lot that I can build on a 2-acre lot. And I can build the same house on, you know, a 1/3 to a 1/2 acre that I can build on 1 acre. So that developer is making his money off the house itself. And as long as his product is similar, he's okay. And a community doesn't need to accept a higher number of homes, which they usually don't want.
Right. Thank you very much. I wanted to ask Roy, because this is very current now. So why should the Big Sewickley Creek watershed study be part of the discussion in terms of regulations for development on the western side of the township?
Thanks, Jim. Yeah, we just finished that, and we'll be posting it once we get final sign off from DCNR. But there were discoveries of some species of special concern in the creek that deserve protection. And the report also identified some conceptual greenway ideas that the township could look at and refine. It was a very desktop type of analysis process, but I think it's a good start if the municipality wanted to look at that as a start for a greenway plan that would ultimately connect with other municipalities. So you have the connectivity happening. And also there's recommendations for maintaining water quality and reducing flood events. One thing we did discover during the interviews with the municipal managers is that municipalities downstream like Leetsdale or Ambridge or Leet were experiencing flash flooding, and it wasn't raining there. It was raining someplace upstream. There was a cloud burst in Franklin Park or in Marshall or in Bell Acres. and it created a flash flood downstream in Lee. So strategic land conservation can help absorb a lot of precipitation over the course of the year. On average, about 800,000 gallons of water can be absorbed per acre of woodlands on an annual basis based on 40 inches of rainfall. So that's a lot of water. And if those woodlands are protected in strategic areas, they start to intercept runoff from other, non-point sources. So the report is full of a number of recommendations that might be considered as part of the comp plan. Bell Acres is in the final stages of adopting the comp plan. As you know, Jim, you're working on that one too. And the recommendations in the Big Spooky Creek Watershed report have been integrated into the comp plan. So it's a lot of information that can add value to the comp plan or other aspects of the township zoning ordinances.
Are there any specific recommendations coming out of that as it relates to zoning or subdivision regulation?
Not really, no.
Okay, so I was thinking of like maybe some distances of protection away from the stream and.
Oh yeah, there's some recommendations there based on the slope adjacent to the stream. There are some recommended setbacks. Mm-hmm.
Great, thank you very much.
Sure.
So Susan, how does the construction of a new sewer line on the western portion of the township impact land use controls and what can be developed? And I'm not so much saying, I mean, it is what it is, it's there, it exists today. But going forward, how does that change or influence what we're doing in terms of recommending development on the western part of the township?
I'm going to take off my legal hat and put on my planner hat because it's more of a planner question. There are certain conditions in a community that drive development, drive interest in developing a community. And those are roads, public water, public sewer. Now, there are other things as well, but they're the main things. So when a public sewer line is constructed, first off, it depends on, you want to look to who owns that line. Whether it be a regulated public utility or it's a privately owned utility or a municipal authority owned utility line, they need to have enough revenue to support that line and the maintenance of the facilities and infrastructure associated with it. So they're going to look to things like additional customers who are going to use that line and pay their rates or customer charges. So there's that interest in pushing for development. There might be a municipal interest. There might be, in order for lines to be extended, there might be, and in fact, in this case, I believe there is an agreement as between the provider and the municipality as to that line and its capacity and the payments that are made for that line. But in some, if a utility like that is in place, sewer particularly, it absolutely drives the question, then why are we talking about lot size? Because typically lot size may be driven by whether you have capacity to put in an on-lot septic system in Pennsylvania. Now, other places, it's a different question, but an on-lot septic system, and if you don't have to have an on-lot septic system, you can connect to a public sewer line, then why are you talking about large lot sizes? What's driving that is a different issue now than the capacity of the land to support that on-lot system. So it is a driver of development. It's a driver of development interest, and it needs to be seriously considered when you're framing out your land use policies and then ultimately your tools to implement those policies, whether that be zoning or subdivision or something else.
Great, thanks, Susan. And I guess we've had some conversations, and I don't expect you to know the ordinances of Marshall in great depth. That's not what we asked you to do as far as this. It's bringing your incredible knowledge about conservation, subdivision design. But there are some things that we talked about prior to this meeting about ways they might consider doing things differently. And some of it has to relate to the calculation of density and what do you include in terms of steep slopes and those kinds of things, and how one calculates that. And I don't mean specifically for Marshall, but in generally speaking, when you've got steep slopes that are already regulated by other kinds of ordinances or wetlands that are regulated by DEP. How do you come about in determining what can fit on that land in terms of those unique natural resources we're trying to protect?
Well, I'm always skating that tension between what's legally defensible and conservation interests. I work for a land conservancy, for goodness sakes. And I'm reasonably cautious. I'm very cautious because I want the municipalities I help to have strong zoning codes that would sustain legal challenges. So if you think about it, a developer would pay more for a flat, well-drained field than they would for a steep, rocky hillside. And in Pennsylvania, there's a court case called Upper Mount Bethel versus Reimer, and Susan can speak to this better than I can, but that supported something called net outs, or subtracting a little bit, not all, but some of the steep slopes, wetlands, floodplain, environmental constraints from that gross lot area when you calculate density. And your codes do exactly that. You call it adjusted tract area, so that a developer who has a pretty flat 10-acre site is going to base the number of homes on 10 acres. If, to keep the math simple, since I'm an English major, if it's 1 acre zoning, that's 10 houses. But if the site is really steep, and after you subtract all that constrained land, the number is 7 acres, then you only get 7 homes. So I was impressed when I just skimmed your ordinance that this is the approach you seem to take. And, you know, you'd like to think, well, if we want to preserve this part of the township, why don't we just have 6 acre zoning? Because I'd rather see, you know, only 1 house for every 6 acres. But the courts in Pennsylvania haven't supported that. And especially if you have public sewer there, they don't support that. So I sort of think the best we can do is a reasonable underlying density. I don't know, your code is currently 1 home per acre. Your comp plan might look at whether that could be a little bit lower. I don't have that answer yet. And then subtract those constraints.
So, and just gently passed it on to Susan in terms of the attorney.
Yeah.
Susan, would you like to add anything in terms of the court case and what people can and can't do in terms of 6 acre zoning, for example?
Okay, so let me take it back first to the comment about the net out. That's been pretty well established in Pennsylvania as an appropriate strategy that's defensible, so long as you do your numbers correctly and you articulate your reasons for carving out those environmentally sensitive lands, whether they be steep slopes or something else. Where you get into trouble is when you start limiting in a greater way the lesser slopes, you know, being a little bit aggressive about saying, okay, well, you know, we understand if it's a 25% slope or a 15% slope, but we're going to apply the same standard if it's a 5% slope. That gets a little dicey in terms of defending it. In terms of lot size, Ann is correct. The courts have not particularly given an open door to you just picking a number out of the hat. And I use this example, it was actually an agricultural preservation, agricultural conservation approach that was used by a municipality. They had done huge amounts of work in preparation of their standards. There was, according to the record, 10,000 pages of record that was put before the court in support of the municipal approach. But at the end of the day, one of the things they did, the last piece of their regulatory program said you had to have a 1 acre lot for the house once you carved out and limited all your agricultural lands and applied all your standards. And at the end of the day, it went up to the Supreme Court of Pennsylvania, and the Supreme Court, out of that 10,000 pages of record, pulled out one statement by the Planning Commission chairman that where he was questioned about how did you get to the 1 acre? And he said, would seem like a good number. And the court threw the entire program out. They didn't just throw out that component, they threw the entire program out. So that's the risk you take when you cannot justify that numeric standard, when at the end of the day, you're just pulling it out of a hat. You can't say somebody next door did it, or, 10 municipalities across the state did it. You really have to really work hard to justify your numeric standards when you're talking about a number of lots, a lot requirement per unit. So whether it's 3 or 2, the larger you get, the higher you get, 5, 6, you really need to work hard, or a challenge will probably be successful to that standard.
Great, thanks, Susan. I'd like to go back to Roy for a second. You mentioned earlier about different ways that you've worked with communities and such to protect naturally sensitive areas. I'd like you to just be a little more specific of what are the options the township has. I think you've mentioned easements and something like that, but if you could just kind of go through your checklist of what communities ought to be thinking about in terms of ways to preserve unique natural resources.
Okay. Jenny, can you pull the map up? This might be a good opportunity just to share this map to see what ALT has accomplished in the northwestern sector of Allegheny County in the last 20 years. So this is a map. You can see 79. You can kind of see where 279 and 79 intersect there on the eastern edge of the map right there. The very top of the map, you'll see a rectangle. That's the very southern portion of the game lands. That rectangle in the northeast corner of the map, just for some orientation, that's the game lands. Central to this map is Swickley Heights Borough Park, which is about 1,000 acres. And the other light green parcels are municipal parks. Everything else in blue is are projects that ALT has done in the last 20 years. These are about 25 projects in 5 municipalities. There's Swickley, Swickley Heights, Swickley Hills, Bell Acres, Franklin Park, and one in Marshall that doesn't show up here in Espanango Trails that was donated to ALT. All of the blue parcels here together combined represent about 857 acres with a appraised value of over $14 million, of which 5.6 million was gifted land outright or gifted land value. In other words, someone may have donated 50% of the land value. So that gets to the point of how this was done and what level of participation by the municipalities. That varied widely. Lynbrook Park, which is just to the southwest of the rectangle representing the state game lands. Lynbrook Park along Big Swickley Creek Road in Franklin Park is adjacent to what we call Lynbrook Woodlands. It's 170 acres to the west of Lynbrook Park. Franklin Park was very, very involved. They contributed funding directly. Their board had a network of business associates that stepped forward and made contributions to that project. So they were very involved financially. Bell Acres has been involved with providing public works department help when there's a cleanup or a parking lot needs gravel or something like that. So it varies. Swickley Heights was very involved with an acquisition in Swickley Heights. So the nuts and bolts of doing this varies depending on the size of the project in terms of the financial need, as well as the landowner's motivation. In some cases, again, some of these parcels were gifted outright, 100%. In other cases, people agreed to bargain sell a property for, in most cases, 50% of its value. So that donation of land value can be leveraged to get grants from DCNR. DCNR grants are 50% match, and DCNR does recognize gifted land value. So most of these are fee simple acquisition where ALT actually bought the land. There are several cases where the development rights were gifted to ALT in the form of a conservation easement, a legal document that might be 15, 20 pages long. But the conservation easement basically severs the development rights from the land. The landowner continues to own the land, but they have severed the right to develop it. In other cases, not necessarily in this geographic area, landowners have donated conservation easements, but they've reserved one right to develop another house, perhaps for a family member that may move back, or if they feel that they need some funds and want to sell that parcel and to someone else, and they're allowed to build a house on it. So, it's every case is different, and every municipality has different capacity to cooperate and participate at whatever level. I did a little research into the Marshall Township budget, and I think in 2020, if I could find it in my notes here, Marshall Township received over $600,000 in real estate transfer fees. So real estate transfer fees are paid when real estate is transferred from one person to another, and the state gets a portion, the county gets a portion, and the local municipality gets a portion. And in 2020, Marshall got $600,000. So, perhaps that might be a funding source that Marshall could dedicate towards land conservation that can be used to leverage additional funds, or a percentage of that money could be dedicated to a local conservation fund. Marshall received $92,000 from RAD in 2020, their allocation from RAD, without even asking for it. They get it. So perhaps, a portion of that or that could be dedicated for a conservation program. Upper St. Clair, over the last 15 or so years, received over $4 million from RAD for Boyce Mayview Park. So there's funding sources out there. The county has programs. We all talked about DCNR. DCED has funding programs as well. So it's not a matter of, if it's possible. It's certainly possible. It just takes the will, of the community to get behind it, and everybody rowing in the same direction, and a lot of good things can happen.
Thanks, Roy. That's very helpful. Susan, some people in our steering committee have talked about this, and I would just be interested in your take on it. Can you speak a little bit about how variances work and how discretionary they are? And some people have just expressed frustration with how variances are given or not given. And what is that role, and when are variances very appropriately used, and when are maybe they probably not the best use of decisions made in the community?
So everyone is on the same page. Of when we talk about variance, this particular kind of variance, we're talking about a variance from a zoning ordinance.
Yes.
I just want to point out to you that that is a relief mechanism. That is a manner by which someone can seek relief from a requirement in the zoning ordinance. There's a comparable relief mechanism for a subdivision and land development ordinance, and that's called either a modification, if it's a partial relief from a requirement, or a waiver. Those are granted by the Board of Supervisors, and there are standards for that, both in the MPC and as articulated by the courts. In fact, I'm sorry, I don't have that name right off the top of my head, but only this year, there was a very important decision issued by the Commonwealth Court that talked about what the court expected when someone is seeking, when the municipality Board of Supervisors is, or the Borough Council is granting relief from the saldo. So, but we're talking about the zoning ordinance, and we're talking about someone who's saying, for one reason or another, I'm applying for relief from a standard or requirement in the zoning ordinance. The only body that can grant the variance is the zoning hearing board. I often see municipal ordinances where that authority is given over to the Board of Supervisors or even the zoning officer. No, no, no. It is only by law. And the law I'm speaking about is the Municipalities Planning Code, which is the enabling authority given by the legislature of Pennsylvania to municipalities to in fact zone at all, to have a zoning ordinance. So they have given that authority to issue a variance to a zoning hearing board. And there are standards in the Municipalities Planning Code for the grant of a variance. I'm going to go briefly through them. I anticipated this question. So the MPC says that and I'm going to abbreviate them a little bit, requires that for granting a variance, there must be unique physical conditions of the property peculiar to that property, and that unnecessary hardship, important term, is due to such conditions and not the circumstances or conditions generally created by the provisions of the zoning ordinance in the neighborhood or the district. So importantly, the relief has to be generated by a condition of the particular property uniquely experienced by that particular property. And that because the second standard is that because of such physical circumstances, there is no possibility that the property can be developed in strict conformity with the provisions of the ordinance. That unnecessary hardship has not been created by the applicant is the third criteria. The fourth is that the variance, if granted, will not alter the essential character of the neighborhood or district, nor substantially or permanently impair the appropriate use or development of adjacent property, nor be detrimental to the public welfare. And the fifth statutory criteria is that the variance, if authorized, will represent the minimum variance to allow relief. Importantly, the municipality repeating these standards is fine. You cannot alter them. You cannot limit them. You cannot kick one of them out, and you cannot add any criteria. These are the statutory criteria for the grant of a variance. We typically think the grant of a variance is a dimensional thing, to a height, to a setback, to lot size, something like that. The courts have said that there is, if it's for certain dimensional requirements, there's a little bit lesser standard of proof. You still have to establish hardship unique to that property, the physical conditions of that property, but you can enter into the discussion economic costs, the costs of compliance with that standard in these certain cases. That's the Hertzberg case, if somebody's interested. When I first came back to Pennsylvania and was looking at variances, I've heard this thing called a use variance. I'm like, what the heck is a use variance? Isn't that a rezoning? Pennsylvania is a little bit unique in the sense that it accommodates a use variance, not a variance from a dimensional standard, but a use variance. And the courts have set the standards for the grant of a use variance. And I'll just read to you those standards. So the courts of Pennsylvania have said, if you're going to get a use variance, not only do you have to meet the 5 criteria that are in the MPC, the statutory criteria, but you also must establish one of these 3 things: that the physical conditions of the property are such that it cannot be used for a permitted purpose, or the property can be conformed for a permitted purpose only at a prohibitive expense, or the property is valueless for any purpose permitted by the zoning ordinance. There is a third type of variance that you often see called a de minimis variance. And what that is a variance that's a deviation from a dimensional standard, for example, a setback or a height limitation, that's so small that the court says you don't even have to apply the statutory criteria to that. All you have to establish is that it's minor and that rigid compliance is not absolutely necessary to protect the public policy concerns of the ordinance. So if the setback is 10 feet and you're asking for a point, like 3/10 of 1 foot, that's a de minimis variance. If you're asking for 4 feet, that's not a de minimis variance. So that standard doesn't apply. And again, that standard has been created by the courts for a de minimis standard. When challenged, the courts apply now, not necessarily your courts of common pleas, which is where you take your land use appeal the first time, but certainly at the Commonwealth Court level, which is a statewide appellate court, hearing all of the land use cases, and to the Supreme Court, should they deign to hear a variance case, they are going to expect that the record establishes that the zoning hearing board clearly applied these standards and granted the variance on these standards. If they didn't grant the variance based on these standards, the court's going to reverse the decision granting a variance. So to a zoning hearing board, I say, this is not the time for you to play. And I'm going to use a personal example again. I worked as a planner for a zoning hearing board in North Carolina. They had similar statutory standards and they were very strict. And because they were very strict on their grants of variances, they had very few applications for variances, maybe one, and it was a very highly developed growth. It was a highly developing area. It was near the Research Triangle Park in North Carolina and where the universities all were. And, they were growing in leaps and bounds, had been for years and were expected to continue. So lots of growth pressures. But even with that, they were very strict and they would get a variance application maybe once every couple months. I then went to the city of Charleston, North Carolina, and the first day I was there, there was the night of a zoning hearing board, and the staff handed me the agenda, and there were 50 variance requests. And I said, how do you do that? Where's the analysis? How do you even get through these proceedings? They're judicial, quasi-judicial in nature. And they said, oh no, we just do an omnibus motion. And then they vote on it. And only if somebody pulls it out of the omnibus motion do they ever have any discussion. And that was because that was the way Charleston uniquely handled these issues, and the courts never bothered with them. You can't take that model and apply it in Pennsylvania. So the rule of thumb is only the zoning hearing board can grant a variance, and they should be applying these standards and not granting a variance by discretion. It's by application of the standards.
Great. Thank you, Susan. I appreciate that level of detail in your answer.
If I can jump in, we have some questions coming in from attendees. This one I think may be for Anne. For the open spaces that are preserved in...
I'm losing you.
Yeah.
No. Can you hear me now? I'll blast at my microphone a little bit more. For the open spaces that are preserved in conservation subdivision, who owns those spaces? Who maintains them or is responsible for them? And are there any restrictions on who can use the space or occupy the space?
Well, is that directed to me or to Anne? Well, Anne, if you want to take that first.
I think she said me, but I'm going to admit first that I will fail the test of your zoning ordinance because while I skimmed it, I don't remember. So the zoning code can establish, and we recommend offering several options. They're not always appropriate in every community. A homeowners association often owns and manages the open space. In some instances, a municipality could take ownership, and we always recommend that townships give the elected board the right to refuse that open space because they may not always want to take it on. And in some cases, a land conservancy could be an owner. That doesn't happen often either. And then in the case of a working landscape like a farm, which you don't have in Marshall Township, it's appropriate to let that original owner, the farmer, maintain open space in some instances. So that can be an option for non-common open space in unique circumstances of working landscapes like orchards or farm fields. And I don't remember what you allow.
I can't hear.
Any better? No?
Yeah, much better.
Good. Staff, send me a clarification. Typically in Marshall, it is the HOA. We also received a question about the calculation of density in Marshall CR district, specifically whether land that can't be developed due to slopes, clays, wetlands, et cetera, factors into the density calculations and would allow for increased density. The short answer to that locally is no. The township's current ordinance does not allow that land to factor in. The township requires that sensitive areas are subtracted out before the number of housing units can be determined. And is that pretty typical in terms of how you see it being done elsewhere?
Yeah, that long tedious description I gave of net outs and adjusted tract area that I suggested that was supported by court cases in Pennsylvania, and Marshall follows that very nicely. They're not overly restrictive. They don't make you subtract those 3% and 5% slopes. You'd have to subtract the entire township, I think. And you do deduct very steep, wet areas, so constrained areas at different rates. So I think the township does a good job of that.
Well, as long as we are kind of talking about the current ordinance and how it might be adjusted at the margins, we received a question regarding whether the township should consider requiring more preserved areas or maybe requiring things like a much larger setback from the main road and at perimeter boundaries, with the idea of creating interior enclaves surrounded by undisturbed areas. So the intent there would be to preserve the township's rural appearance by buffering developments from surrounding roads and properties. Is that something you see happening in? What do you think?
We used to have older cluster ordinances that allowed a lot more homes, a density bonus in return for, sometimes designers call it sort of ring around the collar, surrounding these new developments with a band of open space. Didn't really matter what was there. I mean, if you have a landfill, I think you want to surround it with open areas, but I don't know that that's appropriate for neighborhoods. I think if the community is looking at those beautiful wooded slopes and stream valleys, that you would want to start, and you'd map out those slopes and stream valleys and where the highest quality woodlands are and which areas are best recharging groundwater, because you're an MS4 community. So you have a unfunded mandate to keep the streams clean. And as development comes in, you'd want to connect that open space. The code, I think, does have a perimeter setback that's larger than a standard front yard setback anyway. So I wouldn't make it larger, because you'd sacrifice preserving stream valleys and steep slopes and woods.
I have a question for Susan that was, so there's been a lot of talk and the responses to the questionnaire about, well, why can't we just, have rezone the conservation residential zoning district to something that requires 10 acres per house or 6 acres per house or 20 acres per house. And I guess in general terms, what are the challenges for communities that might consider changing the zoning to a much less dense zoning district like that is described?
So the first challenge is the one that's going to be the subject of litigation, which is, where did you get your number from? What supports the number? And is that reasonable? That you're looking at 5 acres or 10 acres. And that's where I think Ann spoke about this earlier, and I echoed her comment about it. The courts are not particularly comfortable with large lot zoning where you're just picking these large numbers out of the hat. without justification as to why you're burdening that particular property owner in that particular zoning district, which again, you've created, with burdens that no one else is burdened by, and does that intrude on that person's property rights? And so you always have, when you're looking at numeric standards, you always have to follow the path of, is it reasonable and not excessive? And do I have reasons to support the choosing of that particular number? The larger the lot size, the more trouble you may have in satisfying the courts on a challenge to that ordinance.
Jim, can I ask Susan a follow-up question to that?
Yeah, please.
Susan, have you seen slide prone or steep slopes, or perhaps inferior road infrastructure as justification for lower densities?
Typically not for a lower density directly, but to call out steep slopes as an unbuildable area, or an area that needs to be cut out of the lot size, basically the property, to determine what their buildable lot area is. So indirectly, you're looking at density, but only because you're protecting that particular feature in a more direct way, and indirectly affecting density. There is a case out there. I'm just going to put this out there. I'm not sure that it was rightly decided at the end of the day. I don't really know whether it was properly argued by the parties, but there was a circumstance where a property owner had 8 flat areas on top of a plateau, basically, but there were steep slopes leading up to it. And the municipality denied them the right to develop that property, and the court affirmed it on appeal. Which was really surprising because, it was 8 flat acres. It was just the access that was the issue, getting up that steep slope. I think that was sort of an aberrant decision, so I don't know that I'd rely upon it. But again, you can protect steep slopes. You can call for them to be cut out of the development. You can call for them not to be developed. Your roads are not to go up the steep slopes, unless you have other protections in place to minimize the degradation of that steep slope area, the erosion that might occur, the, other harmful impacts that might result from developing a road or some other infrastructure in that steep slope area. But I wouldn't set a lot size based on your steep slopes.
Okay. No, it was more of an issue of perhaps the density, because across the creek in Franklin Park, the northwestern section of Franklin Park is their resource conservation area of the community, of the township, primarily because of slide prone slopes. So the whole area is in that red bed, Gilpin type of geologic structure. So it's more prone for sliding, especially when disturbed by either roads or mass grading. So they just reduced I think their minimum lot size in that general area was 2 acres. When other parts of Franklin Park, the minimum lot size might be 1/4 acre. But because of those sensitive natural features, they increased the lot size, thus reducing the density.
So again, I think that the cleanest way to approach that is to say, if you have a piece of property, you can't calculate for density purposes those areas that are environmentally sensitive. So if you have 10 acres and 5 of them are steep slope or something else, those get pulled out, and then you apply whatever the density is left to that. So if it's 2 acres, then you get 2 lots basically out of that. It's easier to defend, because you've articulated the reasons for protecting or restricting development on the remaining property.
Right, since you were talking earlier, and I apologize if you've already talked about this, but a question came in that was asking about the whole idea of a conservation bond.
Oh, good.
And I just would be interested in knowing a little more about that and how that might help the municipality purchase
Sure.
unique natural resource land.
Yes, very good question. And I'm glad you asked it, Jim. Western Pennsylvania does not do a good job of taking advantage of the tools that are available to raise dollars to protect land, like Eastern Pennsylvania does. And as a consequence of that, Western Pennsylvania is basically exporting tax dollars to Eastern Pennsylvania for land protection. Sorry, Ann. Good job out there, but we're jealous. So one more little factoid before I get into answering your question directly, Jim. An estimated 86% of the grants that DECNR issues in any single year goes to Eastern Pennsylvania. The reason for that is because townships and counties in Eastern Pennsylvania have passed bond referendums generating revenue that they have in their back pocket available to match DECNR funds. In 2019 and 2020, six Eastern Pennsylvania townships residents passed referendums for bonds totaling $42.4 million for land protection. The one passed in 2020, and that was a COVID year. So these bonds were paid off with earned income tax or property taxes in those six cases. And these bonds passed by a fairly slim margin, 52 to 48. The largest margin was 76% for and 24 against in terms of the percentage of the population that voted, for those referendums. So it's unusual for these referendums to fail when they are put up for a vote. And given the survey results that you have in Marshall Township, chances of a referendum passing in Marshall is probably pretty dang good. More close to home, in 2019, the Pittsburgh Parks Conservancy had a referendum pass that generated created a one-half mil increase for properties in the city of Pittsburgh, which is an increase of $50 per $100,000 of assessed value. That generates $10 million annually for the Pittsburgh Parks Conservancy to improve the city parks. So it happens, it can be done, but we're just not doing it in Western Pennsylvania. And because we're not doing it, we're exporting tax dollars to DCNR and then over to Eastern Pennsylvania. So, if Marshall would say, pass a bond and whatever that amount would be, that would be money in the bank that you have every year available to use to leverage additional dollars from DCNR, DCD, the county. And we've done more than double the local money. We've more than tripled the local money on some of these projects if the timing's right. And it's a strong project that resonates with the different funding sources. So again, it's not a matter of if, it's a matter of, if you really want to do it. The resources are out there.
Great, thank you. And I just wanted to ask Susan this question. We're kind of getting near the end, but Susan, so put on your elected official's hat. You've given us your legal hat and your planner's hat. Pretend for a moment that you're an elected official. And you've heard all this stuff tonight. And try to think in terms of if I had to come up with 2 or 3 things that as an elected official, I need to make sure happens from the discussion tonight, what are 1 or 2 or 3 things that would strike you that an elected official might want to think about in moving ahead?
So this is the one I think most won't think about, but I do, which is, have we carefully articulated our land use policy? Do we know what our policy is that we now want to implement in another way? And if we have, then the second one is what do our regulatory tools, what's in our toolbox, what do we have in our toolbox? Not just the zoning ordinance, but the saldo and perhaps a capital improvements budget, whatever it be. What are our tools? And then for those respective tools, are those tools appropriately written to advance our policy and consistent with the law? What does our ordinance call for? And from my personal seat, I think too often the municipal officials really don't know what's in their ordinances. And I've been grateful to have client municipalities where I'm a solicitor, where, you know, we have training sessions where we literally go through, and it's just a workshop where we say, here's what's in your ordinance today. Did you know? And then is that of concern to you? Is there something in there that you're concerned about? So I think I'd want to know those things. And if I really want to get my head around this issue, those are the steps I would go toward.
So I'm going to pin you down a little more. So you talk about the land use policy being something that trying to parallel and match up the regulations to that land use policy. But there's this tension between people who really want to preserve natural resources in the land and minimize development. And there are people who really wouldn't mind having more development, residential development, quality development that goes in, development that protects natural resources. So how does an elected official arrive at that land use policy?
It's why you have multiple members sitting on your board. You might have very different viewpoints, and the
Yes.
board as a governing body has to come to a conclusion as a majority of the board as to what that policy is. And you can appreciate if that policy of, let's say it's pro-development. We've had situations where municipalities have said, come all, one and all, into our municipality. We want that tax base. And the community said, not so, we're not so happy with that. Well, you know, the ballot box is where they voice their opinion, and that particular board might go out and another board comes in that's more sensitive. And it's gone the other way as well. I've seen municipal boards who have been elected who are super, super regulatory. They want to, you know, large lot sizes and, you know, open space and, you know, they're going to articulate all of that and be very aggressive as to their policies. And the electorate says, you know, that's really not what we wanted. And they get voted out for someone who's not so strict in their regulatory approach. So as a board member, I have to decide individually, and I'm assuming I'm not a ward-based community, that I might be from the northeastern corner of the township, but I speak for the township. I'm engaged by the entire township. And I have to, you know, come to come to a point in my own mind as to what's the community's desires, what do I think is appropriate for a community. And there might be some tension there. And I have to negotiate that with my other board members who may have a different view. And eventually the majority of that board is who's going to articulate that policy. What I think doesn't work if they dodge that altogether. It's a hard conversation to have. And sometimes they need mediators to assist them in that conversation. But if they dodge it altogether, then everybody's out there. The ordinances are flip-flopping all the time because nobody really knows what they're intended to do.
So I have one more corollary, and then I'll let you get off the hot seat. So how does an elected official evaluate the risk and benefit of litigation? Because sometimes there is the potential for litigation, and that is a significant cost. And how does one, as an elected official wanting to do what's best for the community, how does that official weigh in, or should they not even consider it, but weigh in the idea that these policies, this land use policy, may in fact result in hundreds of thousands of dollars of litigation fees?
Okay, so the policy itself isn't going to result in litigation. Litigation is going to come up because of the tool that they're using.
Okay.
So it's the tool, and whether that tool is appropriate or not, or can be challenged or not. And, you know, any tool can be challenged. I mean, you see challenges that are frivolous all the time, or challenges that aren't going to win. So this is where I say, as a to the municipal bodies, you need to take seriously the role of your solicitor. You know, don't have your solicitor come to a meeting only when invited. You know, don't ask your solicitor to come in only when there's litigation, and not when you're developing the tool that's an ordinance, which is law. So you have to really take the solicitor seriously, and the solicitor, you know, in that capacity it's an important role. They should be informing their municipality of what is the risk based on either the statutory law or the court-made law, and that's why we do CLE, continuing legal education. We should be keeping up to speed on where the courts are going. And so it's important that the municipal official be willing to hear from the solicitor, and that they expect that the solicitor is giving them serious legal advice about whether some path that they're wanting to go down, some ordinance, some regulatory program is lawful or not, based on either the law, the statutory law, or where the courts are going in their decisions on a particular issue.
Great. Thank you, Susan.
Yeah.
All right, well, the questions we've received this evening show really strong interest in further exploring ways to preserve the unique natural qualities of the western portion of the township. The discussion, I think, has provided a lot of great ideas that our plan steering committee and elected officials can consider moving forward. And we're so grateful to our panelists for their expertise and their time. Thanks to each of you, Anne, Roy, Susan, and thanks to everybody who attended and gave up part of their evenings to be part of this important discourse about future development in the township. So we will have a YouTube link for the video of the event on the plan website early next week. That's at planmarshall.org. We'll also post a follow-up document there with answers to questions you submitted that we didn't get to this evening. There were many. So please continue to stay tuned there for more updates about the plan as it continues to develop. Thank you, everybody. Enjoy the rest of your evening.
And I'd just like to thank Keely at Patrick MTR. She was the person behind the green curtain. It pulled all the levers and did all the things to make sure this all happened. So Keely, thank you so much for your efforts on this.
Thanks, Jim.